Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 20th of June of 2025. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And during this video we're going to discuss the situation on the line of combat contact. Especially we're going to pay attention to the situation in the area of the city of Kupiansk, where according to the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, the Russians managed to break through Ukrainian defense and basically to begin the encirclement of the city of Kupiansk itself and its agglomeration. Furthermore, during this video we're going to discuss the situation in the vicinity of the city of Constantinovka. The Russians improved their position significantly, and now we see that the Russians are trying to establish complete control over the second defense layer or the second supply line between the Pokrovsk agglomeration and the settlement of Drushkovka. So let's start from the beginning and let's start everything in details. And first we're going to talk about another prisoner swap. According to information we have, in accordance with the Russian-Ukrainian agreements reached on June 2nd in Istanbul, a group of Russian servicemen were returned from the territory controlled by the Kiev region. So this information was provided by the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation. Also, the Russians returned Ukrainians back to the territory of Ukraine. And once again, this is very interesting swap of prisoners of war, because this is another exchange when we haven't received even a single number regarding the soldiers, regarding the exact number of soldiers that were returned back to Russia and to Ukraine. And this is very interesting, and something tells me that this is not just a regular prisoner exchange that we used to see, let's say, in 2024 or in the first parts of the 2025. Most likely we can see the final exchange when we will see the formula of all for all. The Russians will return Ukrainians everything they have, and the Ukrainians will return the Russians every single soldier they have. And if this information is correct, obviously this is the beginning of the peaceful settlement of the conflict, because one of the most important paragraph is the exchange of prisoners by formula all for all. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the area of the city of Sumy, where the Russians for some reason decided to stop their offensive operation. According to different sources, according to pro-Russian resources, according to different military experts, we continue receiving updates and details that the Russians continue their offensive operation, that there are very heavy clashes along the line of combat contact, that the Russians are advancing, Ukraine counterattacks. But when talking about the real situation and real changes on the ground in geolocations that we are receiving from this territory, we haven't received anything for a very long period of time. We haven't received anything for a very long period of time, and the only update we got took place probably several days ago when the Russians reported about the securing of the village of Nova Nikolaevka, and that's it from that moment. So, and this is a very interesting situation. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Ukrainian forces counterattacked the Russians in between the villages of Yablunovka and Alexeyevka, and as a result of this counter-offensive operation, the Ukrainians managed to restore control over the village of Varachina. So what does it mean? The Russians at some point stopped their offensive operation, and the Russians began digging deeper process. So they began building trenches, fortifications, they began probably regrouping, making additional stuff with the purpose to improve their positions on the ground. The Ukrainians most likely didn't expect that the Russians would stop, so that is why the Ukrainians began testing Russian defense, and Ukrainians counterattacked, and they managed to restore control over at least one village. And this is a very interesting signal for the Ukrainians, because now they think, what if they attack or counterattack in other directions? What is going to happen? So anyway, the question is why the Russians stopped, why the Russians stopped their offensive operation. And as I understand, currently the Russians are waiting for the reinforcement that is going to arrive from the RDPK, from the North Korea. I would like to remind you that several days ago the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation reported that the DPRK is going to send additional forces and units on the territory of the Russian Federation. First of all, they're going to send engineering forces, and the main purpose of these engineering forces is to restore the Sudzha region and the Kursk region. But obviously we understand that the Russians are going to use the North Koreans engineers with the purpose to secure supply lines. Basically, they're going to build defense and protection nets along the main supply lines. So why is this so important right now? And we can find the answer to this question right exactly in this video. And in this video we can see how Russians were moving in the direction of the city of Sumy without vehicles, just infantry. Just in this episode we can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, maybe 10 or 12 soldiers that that were moving through fields in the direction of the city of Sumy without any support from even light vehicles, motorcycles, just soldiers, and that's it. And Ukrainians were attacking them. This video is not about Ukrainian attack. This video is about the Russian methods. We need to understand that the Russians can continue their offensive operation in the direction of the city of Sumy, but they can't use vehicles deep inside of the territory of Ukraine. And most likely the Russians have possibilities to bring their vehicles approximately to this red line. So this is the line, the edge line, where the Russian vehicles can operate and can work. And as soon as the Russians get this red line, then the Russians are forced to use just infantry to move further in the southern direction. Otherwise, they would be attacked by Ukraine FPV drones and the vehicles would be destroyed. So this is the main problem. And if we calculate the distance approximately, let's say from this red line and let's say edge Russian positions along the line of combat contact, the distance is around 12 kilometers. So imagine yourself how fast the Russian soldiers are while moving through these fields just on their feet with a significant number of weapons and arms behind their backs. Obviously, it can take days before they can cross these territories. And the Russians realize that they have no chances to continue their offensive operation, and now they need to improve their logistics. First of all, they need to establish protection nets around and along the main supply lines. And this is the reason why the Russians are waiting for engineers from DPRK. As soon as they arrive, the Russians will resume their offensive. Basically, the Russians are going to do everything the same thing as Ukrainians currently are doing in the vicinity of the city of Pokrovsk. This video we have already discussed during the previous update. In this video, we can see these protection nets around the main supply lines that Ukrainians managed to create. And obviously, this is not something like a cure against Russian drones, but obviously, this will reduce the losses of Ukrainian vehicles and forces that use these supply lines. This is another example of probably from the same area, and here we can see exactly the process when the Ukrainians were building these nets. There were just 6 soldiers of the armed forces of Ukraine that most likely created this corridor during probably several days. Imagine yourself what exactly the Korean engineers, 5,000 of Korean engineers are able to create if they are sent, let's say, in this area. So the Russians are waiting this. As soon as the Koreans begin building these nets, protection roads, the Russians will be able to start using vehicles, tanks, infantry fighting carriers, and then the Russians will be able to resume their offensive operation in the direction of Sumy. And obviously, we are talking not about years or months, probably 1-2 weeks, and the Russians will resume their offensive. Basically, the Russians secured the first defense line, almost secure, and they will finish the battle for Yunakiivka, and then it's going to be just a matter of how fast the Koreans are able to build these protection nets corridors. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the most important area, and we're going to talk about the Kupiansk direction and the small village by the name of Mirova, which is located to the northwest of the city of Kupiansk itself. So what is happening today according to different sources? Today the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation published probably the most important update during the previous 24 hours and probably maybe since the beginning of this year. According to information we have, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to establish complete control over the village by the name of Moskovka. So Moskovka is a former title of this village. This village currently, according to Ukrainian legislation, has the title of Mirova. This village used to be Moskovka. The Ukrainians renamed villages. The Russians use old titles and old names of all these settlements. So according to this report that was published by the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, we have adjusted this territory in Russian favor. I would like to tell you that currently nobody in the world, just maybe the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, some Ukrainian sources, soldiers, knows exactly how the Russians managed to do this and what kind of territories should be colored in Russian favor. We colored this pocket based on the borders of these villages, of this village of Moskovka, that you can find on different maps that are located in the internet, in the open source. villages. So these are the border of this settlement, and based on the borders of this settlement and based on the report of the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, we adjusted the map in this area. So let's compare the map between the dates. For example, this is the situation by the end of the 19th of June of 2025. What we have by the end of the previous day, the Russians just secured the village of Kondrashovka. The Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation also confirmed this information probably a month ago, but just now we got geolocations from the southern and the southwestern part of the settlement. Here we can see how the Russians were attacking the village, and on the final part of this video we can see a moment when two Russian soldiers raised their flags in this part of the settlement. This is the flag of the Russian Federation, probably a flag or sign of the unit that was responsible for the battle for this territory. So just yesterday we got this video, and obviously this is a proof that the Russians secured the entire village of Kondrashovka, or at least the main part, the northern and the western, the eastern, and so on. What we had next by the end of the 19th of June, the village of Radkovka was colored as a contested area or the gray zone, because several weeks or months ago the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation also confirmed control over this territory. Later, several mappers like neutral or pro-Ukrainian reported about Ukraine counterattacks and that Ukrainians managed to restore control over this territory, but without any proof. So that is why we have been keeping this territory for several weeks as a contested area or the gray zone. And today the Russians reported that they secured the village of Mirova, and based on this video we colored the village of Mirova itself and the territory of Radkovka, so the former contested area. But once again, we don't know for sure where exactly is the line of combat contact. Basically, we colored the village based on its borders according to several open sources. Anyway, this is very important piece of news, because now we see that if this information is correct and if this information is true, then the Ukrainians that are located in the territory of the city of Kupiansk are in big trouble. Basically, the Russians managed to cut the main supply lines or establish almost complete control over them. Now we understand that Ukrainians has poorest logistic ever on the territory of the city of Kupiansk and its agglomeration, and we expect that the situation is going to even get worse and worse. So first of all, let's add these supply lines of the armored forces of Ukraine. The first supply road is N32 Road that goes, let's say, from the city of Kharkiv further in the eastern direction towards the city of Kupiansk. So this is the first supply line that Ukrainians have possibility to use to support their forces. But this is not the only supply line. Another one is the road R79 that goes from the city of Kupiansk first in the southwestern direction towards the village of Siniha, and then in the western direction through these local villages, local roads in the area of Baranova, and then further in the western directions towards the city of Kharkiv itself. So these are the two supply lines that Ukrainians have to support their forces and to support their contingent in this Kupiansk agglomeration. But now we see that the Russians secured the village of Mirova, and basically the Russians managed to shorten the distance to the most important line, and currently the distance between possible Russian edge positions and this line itself is less than 3 kilometers, which is obviously nothing for Russian artillery strikes, for Russian FPV drones, and for Russian probably soldiers of sabotage and reconnaissance group. So basically one of the roads, this one was already cut by the Russians, maybe not physically, but at least with fire control and probably with some raids of sabotage and reconnaissance group. But we see that the Ukrainians still have possibilities to hold their pens on the territory of the Kupiansk agglomeration using R79 road that goes in the southwestern direction. I would like to remind you another important piece of news that we got in the beginning of June of 2025. This is the update I'm talking about. According to information we have that we got on the 11th of June, most likely the Ukrainians by the 11th of June realized that the situation was already critical. The forced evacuation zone has been expanded in the Kharkiv region. We are talking about the settlements of the Kupiansk district, Baranovka, Berezovka, Novonikolaevka, and many other different villages. So according to that report that we got on the 11th of June of 2025, the Ukrainians announced the evacuation of this territory. And as you can see, all these villages are located along main supply lines that Ukrainians still have possibilities to use to support their forces on the territory of the Kupiansk agglomeration. And this is very important piece of news, because now we understand understand that Ukrainians evacuated all these villages just with one purpose: to replace civilians with military soldiers. The Ukrainians needed every single building, every single structure, with the purpose to fill these constructions with Ukrainian soldiers, vehicles, weapons, arms, munitions, equipment, tanks, and many other different things, just with one purpose: to support these main roads and not to allow the Russians to cut this road physically. So from these positions, from these evacuated positions, the Ukrainians will try to hold the neck of the Kupiansk agglomeration and not to allow the Russians to cut the Kupiansk agglomeration in Cauldron. But obviously, when talking about this territory, the Russians have several options. Of course, the Russians can continue offensive operation deep inside of the city of Kupiansk itself from the northwestern direction. Furthermore, we believe that the Russians are going to maintain their lines between the village of Mirne and the settlement of Gluboka and the river Voskol. The Russians need to shorten their lines by taking under control these territories. This will improve the Russian logistic. Of course, if the Russians are going to move further in the southern direction, first of all, the Russians need to improve their positions in the northern direction by taking under complete control the villages like Velika Shapkovka, Mala Shapovka, and Tishenkovka. The Russians need these territories if they don't want to get a counterattack from the Ukrainian side in their back. If the Russians are not going to secure these territories, most likely the Ukrainians would use this situation to counterattack the Russians in their back, with the purpose even maybe to cut the Russians, some Russian group of forces, from the mainland and to cut them in Cauldron. So this is about the northern face of X of the Kupiansk agglomeration. But obviously, when talking about this map and when talking about this configuration, it becomes clear that the Russians, most likely in the very near future, will try to cross the river Voskol in the vicinity of the settlements of Kruglakovka, Sinkova, with the purpose to establish complete over positions of the armored forces of Ukraine on the Ukrainian bank of the river Voskol, with the purpose to cut N32 Road and to get as close as possible to supply lines, to this supply line, to the second supply line that Ukrainians can use to support their forces on the territory of the Kupiansk agglomeration. So as for the northern X, everything is clear. The Russians managed to improve their position. As for now, without geolocations to confirm this. As for the southern direction, we expect that this offensive operation of the armored forces of the Russian Federation is going to start in the very near future. Because if the Russians are able to cross the river Voskol, to take under control the village of Sinkova, to move in the direction of Siniha, then the Russians will be able to cut these supply lines, and then this is going to be operational encirclement of the Kupiansk agglomeration that can lead to the Cauldron. And obviously, this is going to be the biggest disaster for the armored forces of Ukraine on the entire Kharkiv direction, that can lead to completely unpredictable consequences to the entire contingent of the armored forces of Ukraine in this area. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Constantinovka direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation. As we discussed in the previous video, the Russians managed to cut the Ukrainians in Cauldron in the area of Katerinovka, Kliban, Byk, and Sherbinovka. And during the previous 24 hours, the Russians were forced and focused just on one, probably, let's say, tactics. The Russians were trying to tighten the noose around this Cauldron, around this pocket, for as much as possible. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians already established complete FPV drone control over the northern and the northwestern parts of this Cauldron. The Russians destroyed almost everything they managed to discover. Especially this video is very interesting. In this video we can see how Russian drone without any resistance was flying above this small pocket. In this video we can see how several vehicles already on the territory of Kliban Byk were destroyed, and another Russian drone was flying above this area without any resistance from the Ukrainian side. So the Ukrainians can't get out of these buildings because hundreds of drones are already flying above their heads. So as I understand, the Ukrainians lost any possibility to evacuate themselves using N32 Road in the northern direction. So they basically can't use this road anymore due to many factors, and the most important is the significant number of drones flying above this area. Another important direction is the western part of this area, where as we can see, the Russians also managed to establish complete FPV drone control. In this video we can see how Russian drones were flying above this area as well, trying to destroy as many as possible, basically everything they managed to discover and to find out. A lot of episodes of destroyed Ukraine vehicle positions and say different equipment and so on. So the Russians secured and cut the northwestern Road, and the Russians most likely managed to cut the northeastern and the northwestern roads altogether. The Ukrainians from this pocket are not able to evacuate themselves from this area, or if they decide to start evacuation, this will probably lead to significant losses. And this is not the only problem that the Ukrainians managed to face and managed to see. The Russians continue their offensive operation in the western part of this village of Yablunovka. And as you can see, according to these changes on the ground, the Russians improved their position significantly by taking under control additional territories. And the most important, the Russians almost completely secured the southwestern part of the village of Yablunovka. Today, the Russian sources published this video, and in this video we can see how exactly the Russians were fighting for the southwestern part of the village of Yablunovka. For example, in this very moment we can see how Russian motorcycles, bikers, were entering the village of Yablunovka in the southwestern part. So in this episode we can see another FPV drone strike, and after this attack, after the Russians suppressed Ukrainian positions, several bikers entered the territory, moved through the main street of this western part of Yablunovka, entered this territory, landed infantry, and secured several buildings and digged in deeper. And in the final episode of this video, right after the Russians secured this part of the village, we got another episode, but this time Russian fighting vehicle was moving in the direction of the village of Yablunovka itself. And in the final episode of this video, we can see how Russian soldiers were crossing the anti-tank ditches, and when they crossed anti-tank ditches, they entered the southwestern part of Yablunovka. So if we return back to the map, I would like to describe this video on the map. You will better understand this. So Russian motorcycles were moving along this street from the west in the eastern direction with the purpose to get as deep as possible. Russian motorcycles stopped somewhere here, and right from this point Russian stormtroopers moved in the northern direction and secured this building. So this is the first attack that was carried out by the Russians during that video. In the final episode, we could see a Russian vehicle that was moving from the south in the northern direction. Russian vehicle stopped somewhere here, right in front of these anti-tank ditches. Russian infantry crossed these anti-tank ditches and entered the village of Yablunovka in this area. So based on this video, we adjusted the map in this part of the settlement under complete Russian control. So now we see that the situation is very difficult for the Ukrainians, and it seems that the battle for the Kupiansk pocket is about to be finished, and this battle will be finished obviously with a complete defeat, and most likely with the cauldron for the armored forces of Ukraine along the river of Kryvyi Tarets and this railway. So the situation is critical. Now let's talk about the situation along N32 Road, where the Russians also managed to improve their positions. This information was confirmed by pro-Ukrainian sources. Doomsday today adjusted their maps, but nothing new to our map. All these territories that were updated by pro-Ukrainian sources were updated by us several days ago based on geolocations and based on the reports of the Minister of Defense. But the most and the key value of this update is that Ukrainian sources also confirm that the Russians are attacking in this area. But this progress on the ground is not the most important. The most important is this concentration of icons. I would like to point your attention that there are a lot of icons exactly in this area, and all these icons have their value. They're very important. Let's discuss them in details. According to information we have, and according to this video that was published by the Russian side, during the previous 12 hours, 24 hours, the Russians managed to destroy a lot of bridges in this area. Right, exactly in this video, maybe with not very good quality, we can see how Russians were attacking Ukrainian logistic and Ukrainian drones with ground drones, with artillery strikes, with FABs, with missiles Ha-38, and as a result of these attacks, lots of bridges of the armored forces of Ukraine logistic were destroyed. So this is very important video, and if we go back to map, we're gonna find that most of the bridges were destroyed in the vicinity of the settlements of Vladimirovka, Shakhova, and Novotoretskaya. So, for example, this is one of the bridges that was destroyed by the Russian ground drones along the river of Казённый Торец. This is the first bridge that was destroyed. This is, for example, the second bridge along the same river that was destroyed during that video that we just seen. And this is another bridge that was destroyed. As for this bridge, it's unclear whether the bridge was destroyed by by Gerain or probably with something else. But anyway, when talking about the previous video, we got just attacks with drones. When talking about this video, we can see the real consequences of another Russian attack. Some civilian was filming this area, and he was searching for probably some who managed to survive, or he was just trying to record the damage the Russians managed to deal. But in this video we can clearly see that the bridge, another bridge along the river of Казённый Торец, was also destroyed by the Russians as a result of another attack. And as you can see, according to this geolocation, this by the way, this attack was geolocated, this bridge was destroyed exactly in this area. So now we see that the village of Vladimirovka of the armored forces of Ukraine were cut completely from the mainland. Ukrainians are basically cut without supply and support. They can't bring forces. Probably they still have possibilities to bring some forces from Novotoretsk, but it's an unclear situation with the bridges in this area. Maybe these bridges were also destroyed, but we either haven't received geolocation or video about this. Anyway, the situation is critical because when talking about Vladimirovka, there are several villages to the east of this area, and most likely now the Ukrainians who are currently located on the territory of these farms, on the territory of Popov Yar and Poltavka, were left by the Ukrainians or by the results of this attack without supply and support, which means that the Russians are going to intensify their offensive operation in this area with the purpose to establish control over as many as possible territories during the next several days. We expect that during the next days we're going to see lots of and huge changes on the ground, and most likely something like this would be colored in Russian favor probably during 1 or 2 or 3 weeks during June of 2025. And another important thing is that to the north of this let's say area of these Russian drone activities, we got a lot of videos of this type, and here we can see how Russians were hunting and searching for positions of the armored forces Ukraine FPV drone operators. So we see that the Russians first destroyed logistic, then they hunted and destroyed Ukrainian FPV drone operators, and now everything is clear for further offensive. Operator bases destroyed, logistic destroyed, obviously not completely, but obviously this might be enough for another progress on the ground. But of course the Ukrainians are trying to do something. When talking about this let's say defense layer and this supply line, we believe that Ukrainians don't believe anymore that they're able to hold this territory under complete control. The bridges were destroyed, the Russians established control over with FPV drones, so I'm not sure that they're wait that they can save this line under their control. But when talking about further lines and further supply lines, the Ukrainians are trying to establish as many as possible these protection nets. This will allow the Ukrainians to reduce number of Russian drones that can fly above this territory. This video we have already discussed, but this is very valuable video which show us probably how exactly the special military operation will develop in the second part of 2025. Once again, we expect that thousands of kilometers of Ukraine, of roads of Ukraine and Russia would be covered with these protection nets with the purpose to reduce risks from FPV drones using fiber optic technologies. Now let's move further. As for the South Donetsk direction, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians continued their offensive operation in the area of the village Zaporozhye. Several sources reported that the Russians managed to outflank the village and to move through the tree lines in the western direction. This information was confirmed by pro-Russian and by neutral resources. So as you can see, this territory was cut into many pieces, and now the Russians will handle with every single village separately. So we expect that this pocket will collapse in the very near future. Very interesting updates are coming from the Gulay-Polye direction. During the previous days, we were talking a lot about Russian offensive operation in the area of the village by the name of Malinovka, and we made changes on the ground, and several sources reported that the Russians managed to answer the village itself to improve their positions. Several pro-Russian resources adjusted southern tree lines to the village, and today we got this very important video that was published by the Ukrainian sources. In this video, according to the author of this video, we can see a edge Russian positions on the territory of the village of Malinovka. The Ukraine author says that the Russians managed to take this church under complete control, and right exactly in this moment the Ukrainians were bombing and attacking the Russian positions there with the purpose not to allow them to dig in deeper. So this video was geolocated, and this is exactly the church that was taken by the Russians under control according to pro-Ukrainian author, and based on this video we have adjusted the map. So now we see that by the end of the 20th of June of 2025 the Russians secured up to 15% of the village of Malinovka, and obviously the Russians continue their offensive. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching, subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.